Okay, it's straight up 12 noon, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference webinar series. The conference has always prided itself on the latest research on nutrition and management, and we've expanded the impact on the industry to this webinar series. Conference and webinars are a collaborative effort of Iowa State University Extension, University of Illinois Extension, University of Minnesota, and University of Wisconsin Extension. Our topic today concerns the timing of AI relative to estrus and ovulation, and we know that it has a profound effect on fertility. Our presenter today is Dr. Paul Fricke. He was raised on his family's row crop and dairy farm in Nebraska, and his father and uncle continue to farm today. After receiving his BS in animal science from the University of Nebraska, Dr. Fricke went on to complete his master's degree and PhD from North Dakota State University. Dr. Fricke worked on his postdoctorate research associate in the Department of Dairy Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then joined the faculty on July 1st, 1998. Dr. Fricke has been promoted to full professor with tenure in 2004, in 2009. Dr. Fricke, we're always delighted to have you. And as I always say, the podium is yours.
All right. Thank you, Fred. I really appreciate the invitation to speak on the webinar. And what I'm going to do for everybody today, and thanks for everybody for signing on today. I'm going to go through a presentation that I did in a breakout at the Fourth State meeting. And this is some new data that we have. It's an old topic, but with some new data. So very practical, I think. This is the kind of stuff that you can take out directly to dairy farmers and help them with their breeding programs. So as Fred said, it has to do with the effective timing of AI relative to synchronized ovulation or increased activity using these activity monitoring systems. So as Fred said, timing of AI is important for fertility. When I'm asked to look at a conception rate problem on a dairy, I split them up into these 4 different buckets that you can see here on the screen. So timing of AI relates to the timing that we put the semen, timing that we inseminate relative to behavioral estrus and or ovulation. And we'll expand on that in just a few minutes. Some of the other things that affect fertility, though, would be AI efficiency. This is everything to do with the inseminator. Male fertility, if you're using artificial insemination, that's the best way to control male fertility, but it has to do with if you're using AI, is the semen in the tank still good? If you're using bulls, this can be a big problem. And then the last area here is this one of female fertility. Most everything else, we have a lot of control over these first 3, not as much control over this last one, but certainly we have a lot of control over this issue of timing of insemination. So the first thing I want to talk about is breeding cows based on behavioral estrus. The way that we do this a lot on farms, we've done this for a long time. What we know about estrus, behavioral estrus, is that ovulation is going to occur about 27.6 hours after the first standing event of estrus. And this is older data from Ray Niebel back in the day when they were using these pressure-activated mounting detectors. And so we know kind of when they're going to ovulate, and the key is we got to put semen in at the right time relative to that ovulation. So insemination has to occur before ovulation to allow time for sperm capacitation and transport. And so this brought up this is good information to know as far as when to breed a cow. And then artificial insemination came along, and since we're not letting the bull do it anymore, we needed some kind of a rule by which we could breed these cows. And so this became known, this AM/PM rule, widely known in the dairy industry. Fred, I like to say that I am trying to kill off the AM/PM rule so that no one even thinks about it anymore. But what the AM/PM rule said was a cow observed in estrus in the morning should be inseminated 12 hours later. If the cow is observed in estrus in the afternoon or evening, she should be inseminated 12 hours later in the next morning. And I want to look at the question you have to ask is, where did this recommendation come from? What data allowed us to have this recommendation? Remember, this is a recommendation that was made when artificial insemination was fairly new. It was a new technology, and people had to have some kind of a general rule by which to breed their cows. So as far as we can tell, the origin of the AM/PM rule came from these data. This was from 1943, a Nebraska Agriculture Experiment Station bulletin number 129. And the first thing I'll say about this data is that these numbers are very low. Okay, so we need lots of numbers to calculate conception rate or pregnancies per AI. But I think in general, these data captured the essence of what we're talking about. You can breed too early. Like if you bred the cows right at the start of estrus, we had lower conception rates compared to the middle or the end of estrus. And then if you breed shortly after estrus, within 12 hours after estrus, the fertility was better than if you waited a lot longer. And so these are the data kind of where we came with the AM/PM rule. Now, a lot of people still talk about the AM/PM rule. This is, again, some work from Ray Niebel. And what they did is they had large numbers of cows that were bred strictly using the AM/PM rule or using a once daily routine where you just tail chalk the animals and a breeder would show up once a day and go ahead and breed the animals that were in heat previous 24-hour period. And if you look at the 75-day non-return rate, which is what they did with this data, there was absolutely no difference. So no real reason to strictly adhere to the AM/PM rule versus a once daily breeding program. This is similar data, a smaller data set in heifers. Again, if you look at conception rates, the AM/PM rule is not different than once daily AI. Now, what I would say about these data is that both the AM/PM rule and once daily breeding are equally as bad, equally as sloppy, I guess, as each other. Neither of these methods optimizes pregnancies per AI or conception rate. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I get to the new data that we have. So no real reason to use the AM/PM rule. So if we just summarize timing of AI to a visual estrus, it's not necessary to strictly adhere to the AM/PM rule. Again, I think we don't really need to do that. In fact, what I would say, if you do strictly adhere to the AM/PM rule, on balance, you're going to breed the cows too late. And so that'll result in lower fertility. Once daily AI programs result in acceptable fertility, and I'll make a little caveat here. This is certainly true for conventional semen, like in heifers. Once daily breeding programs work really good with conventional semen. We have a little bit of data that would suggest, though, this may not be true for sex semen, especially in heifers. Okay, so I don't think you can do the once daily breeding routines with sex semen in heifers. A cow observed in estrus can be inseminated immediately rather than waiting 12 hours. And that's pretty much the current recommendation. If you see this kind of activity on your farm and you're checking for heat a couple times a day, chances are this cow has been in heat for a while. It's almost impossible to breed her too early. So you can just go ahead and breed the cow rather than waiting. Okay, so that's just a review of stuff that I've talked about throughout my 25-year career as far as just timing of insemination to an estrus. Just old data, just wanted to review that. So in 1995, along comes this OVSync protocol. I think all of you are familiar with this protocol. You give GnRH, 7 days later, you can treat with prostaglandin. This original paper in 1995 had a 48-hour interval between the prostaglandin and the GnRH. And then they kind of made their best guess as far as when to breed based on data. And they said, let's put a 16-hour time interval in here. And the question I want to answer now is, where did the recommendation for time to AI at 16 hours after this relative to this GnRH treatment originate? And so we're going to go back to, this is probably the third major study Pursley and Wiltbank did after they invented the Ovsync protocol. This was published in 1998. It's a very important data set. Here's the Ovsync protocol. And then what they did is they randomized these cows. I think there was 700 and some cows in this study, about 150 per treatment. And what they did is they randomized them to be inseminated at these different times. So the 0 hour is at the same time as this last GnRH treatment. We'd call that a co-sync nowadays. Then there were cows who were bred at 8, 16, 24, and 32 hours. And remember what I told you about the onset of estrus. The onset of estrus is about the same physiologically as that last GnRH treatment. So these cows are going to ovulate between 24 and 32 hours. And as I said, we want to breed them before they ovulate so that we know this 32-hour time period is going to be probably worse than the rest. So that's the experimental design, and here's the data. And what you can see, if you're a normal human being, you can look at these numbers and say, well, obviously 16 hours is the best. It's 45% versus 41 or 37 and 32. So that's just using human common sense, but we have this activity that we do with scientific data, which is called statistical analysis. And if you do statistics on a design like this, these blue bars are not statistically different from each other. In other words, there's not enough numbers of cows in here to say that 45% is better than 37% or 41%. What we can say is that this last treatment at 32 hours is lower. Nonetheless, this was the best data that was available to answer the question. And so what happened is we all started recommending this 16-hour as the optimal time for fertility relative to one of these Ovsync protocols. And so that's about as good as we could do as far as the data were concerned. And so we have this 16-hour time period. And, this is a very common question that I get when people are not satisfied with conception rates to these time-to-eye protocols. They'll ask me things like, well, we're not really breeding at 16 hours, we're breeding at 12 hours, or breeding at 20 hours. How much of a difference does that make? So I want to address this a little bit more with the newer data as I get towards the end of my seminar. So something started to happen in the industry around this time. This is a paper from 2008. We had a lot of farms that modified this protocol. So the bottom protocol is our recommended protocol nowadays. So we would give GnRH on a Monday morning, prostaglandin 7 days later on a Monday morning. Wednesday, we push this GnRH to the afternoon, and then you can put this 16-hour interval in here, and we can breed Thursday morning. Really, the 56-hour interval was so that we could breed in the morning, which is when most breeders want to breed. So this is what we call an Ovsync 56 protocol, which is the recommended protocol. A lot of farms started to implement these co-sync protocols. And I still, to this day, get the question from farmers and breeders, how much do I lose by breeding the cows at the same time as this last GnRH treatment? And the reason people want to do this is it's easier. We can go Monday morning, Wednesday morning, GnRH and breed. Much simpler protocol, especially for like 2X dairies. Here's the data from this study in 2008. The difference in conception rate, there's almost 500 cows per treatment. 27% conception rate with the co-sync, 36% conception rate with the Ovsync 56. That's a 17% increase in conception rate. And I just bring this up because I still get this question. I did some talks out in Idaho this last year. A lot of these large dairies with dry lots will want to do these co-sync protocols, and they do these co-sync protocols. They were not happy at all with me telling them that this is the right way to do it. And this is just the biology that we're dealing with here, the Ovsync 56. Okay, I'm a scientist. This is not scientific data. This is completely anecdotal, but I had a consultant from an 1,850 cow Holstein herd in Wisconsin send me this data and ask the question. This is first service. Here they're breaking out conception rates for sex semen in lactating dairy cows, 26% conception rate, which is unacceptably low. Conventional beef semen was at 54%. You can see it was pulling down their overall conception rate. So I asked them what they were doing, and I'll back up a slide. What they're doing is this co-sync protocol. And so I told the farm, I said, well, let's do this. Let's try moving to this bottom protocol. And they said to me, well, we don't want to do this bottom protocol. And I said, well, just humor me and try it. Let's try switching from the co-sync protocol to an OVSync 56 protocol for just say like a 6-month period of time. And what happened, if you come back and look, sex semen increased to 51% from 26%. Beef semen was 54% to 58%. So this is, I just show this not as scientific data, but to show you that this is the kind of a thing that I'm seeing out there in some cases, especially with co-sync protocols. So one of the things that I did recently is I wrote this article for Horde Stereomen. It came out in the June issue. It was just one of the Horde Stereomen Intel little blurbs. Stop doing co-sync. So co-sync is fun and easy, but the take-home message, if there's one thing you want to take home from my seminar today, we don't want to do these co-sync protocols. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and talk about some trends that have been happening in the dairy industry as we've improved reproductive performance on dairies. What we've seen is a dramatic increase in use in beef semen. So this is concurrent with kind of the increases in conception rate that we've seen over time. So this is from 2024 information. I don't know how much higher we can go with beef semen, but interestingly, of the 9.4 million units of beef semen sold domestically in 2024, just under 8 million units were used in dairy herds. That was up nearly a million units from the year before. And you can see that there's a lot of sex-sorted semen being used, 9.9 million units about this. And if you compare that actually to conventional dairy semen, it was only at 6.2 million units. So we're seeing this tremendous increase in the use of beef semen, increase in the use of sex semen. Beef semen, I just throw this in here because it's always amazing to look at. We're looking at, in Lamar, Wisconsin, we're looking at beef cross calves, $1,050 to $1,635. So of course, farmers are wanting to get these crossbred calves in our U.S. market. And so we're seeing increased use of beef semen and sex semen. We took a look at this in a study that we did back in 2003. This was a very large data set we got from DRMS. Kind of a complicated graph or figure here. So I'll just break it down. This is year in the column. So 2019, 2020 in the middle, on the right here, 2021. The rows are, these are non-lactating heifers, first lactation cows, second lactation cows, third plus lactation cows. And then it's a stacked bar graph. So the red is beef semen. The blue colors are Holstein conventional, Holstein sex. You can't really see the other dairy in this graph. And then we have it by service number within the year. And all I'll point out here is that sex semen use and beef semen use are increasing over time. A lot of sex semen being used in these younger animals, the non-lactating heifers, as well as some of the first lactation cows. And as these animals get older, we see more beef semen being used. And so with the increased use in sex semen, what we're seeing is we can't really use much more sex semen in the heifers. So we're starting to see more and more sex semen being used in the lactating herd. And so this brings up a question: should we inseminate later with sex-sorted semen? And I'd be interested if any of you have any comments, if you want to stick it in the chat. A lot of people are talking about this. This idea that with sex semen, we have to change the timing of insemination. And again, where did this idea come from? There's a couple different studies, I think, where this originated from. And the thing I want to say about these studies, they're not really experiments, they're observations, okay? So what they did in both situations, they had Jersey lactating cow herds. And what they did is they recorded when the animal was triggered an activity system and when they were inseminated. Again, the cows weren't randomized to treatments or anything. They had no sex semen, conventional semen comparison. It was just with sex semen. And what they estimated from the data was, well, it looks like we need to breed a little bit later for optimal fertility, and that's based on when they thought they were ovulating. So I mean, I'm just saying it's a little bit of a question mark, kind of where this came from. Both of these studies inseminated later, 18 to 20 hours after the onset of estrus activity, yielded increased fertility with sexed semen. So there's this idea that we need to breed later. Now, I think this might be true with estrus situations. So I'm going to fly through this a little bit quickly. What we know about these high-producing lactating dairy cows is that they metabolize a lot of ovarian steroids. So high feed intake drives high milk production, but high feed intake also drives increased liver blood flow. And when we see increased liver blood flow, we see decreased circulation of estradiol and progesterone. And what that does is it changes the physiology of these cows. And this is from a review paper that I did with my colleague, Dr. Wiltbank. In heifers, this is kind of the period in which they're going to ovulate. So at the end of the cycle, progesterone is going to decrease because in a non-pregnant animal, we'll get prostaglandin released from the uterus. Once you get progesterone out of the picture, we increase LH pulses from the anterior pituitary. We'll grow this follicle. This follicle that will then secrete enough estradiol to cause this GnRH surge and then an LH surge, and we ovulate a 15 millimeter follicle. And so this is a very tightly coordinated series of events. You'll see estrus, you'll see ovulation, you'll see ovulation of a normal sized follicle. What we think happens in these high producing dairy cows, which is shown in red here, is that because the liver's metabolizing more estradiol, what happens is estradiol rises at a slower rate. And we actually see an extended period of LH pulses and delayed LH surge and ovulation of a much larger follicle. And so what we think happens is we overexpose the oocyte to LH pulses, we get premature oocyte maturation, we ovulate an aged oocyte, and we ovulate a much larger follicle. And so this is what we think is the problem with high-producing dairy cows in fertility to estrus breedings. But the point I want to make is that these high-producing cows are probably ovulating later relative to the onset of estrus, which would make it look like breeding later with sex semen is better. Okay, so that's my point with all this. With an estrus situation, with breeding with sex semen, yeah, breeding a little bit later might be good because not because it's changed because of the sex semen, it's just that the cows are ovulating a little bit later. Okay, so this brings me to a study that we did in lactating dairy cows. We collaborated with ABS, so this is their sex cell product. And we wanted to control the timing of ovulation in one of these timed breeding programs and then look at whether delaying insemination would be good or not. So we went to 3 different dairies in the upper Midwest, 3 large dairies. They're all using this protocol for first insemination. Standard double ovsync protocol, GnRH in the afternoon, timed AI the next morning. This gives us an interval from GnRH to timed AI of 16 hours, which is our recommended interval that I talked about before. Now, what we did, rather than delaying timed AI because the breeders wanted to breed in the morning and they weren't going to come back and breed in the afternoon, we changed the timing of that last GnRH treatment. So what we did is we moved it to the morning, which extends this interval by inducing ovulation earlier. Essentially, we're breeding later relative to ovulation. Okay, kind of a complicated way of doing this. Again, there's a couple different things that change the timing of the GnRH as well as the timing of AI relative to ovulation. Suffice it to say, we've had good ideas and bad ideas. This was a bad idea. Delaying, giving that GnRH earlier actually decreased fertility at 34 days as well as at 80 days. Okay, so basically our conclusion from this, and I'll just include this as well. This is the group in Ireland did a similar study with their kind of synchronization protocol, but what they did is they had a 16-hour time interval, which is the correct time interval, and they increased it to 22 hours. So in this study, very nice experimental design where they're delaying the timed insemination. And what they found is that if you looked at the conventional semen, it was better than sex semen, about You get 80 to 85% the fertility with sex semen of conventional semen, but delaying breeding in this particular study had no statistical increase in pregnancies per AI. And I could show you a number of different data sets that have tested this hypothesis. When you control the time of ovulation in heifers or cows, delaying breeding does not improve things with sex semen. So here's another recommendation that I would make if you're using a double ovsync protocol, especially in first lactation cows, which is where a lot of the sex semen is being used in the dairy industry. Keep the standard timing of the second generation timed AI. Give that generation in the afternoon, breed the next morning. Do not change these times if you're using sex semen in conjunction with this protocol. Okay, so that brings me to this last study, and this is the new study. This paper just came out in the Journal of Dairy Science, and it's got 3 different studies in it, 3 different data sets that we analyzed. One of the studies is a randomized controlled experiment. The other 2 are large observational studies. So I just want to walk through these 3, and this is the newer data that we have, which we've been making some recommendations based on lately. So this first experiment was all done with conventional semen. It was a randomized controlled trial comparing the time of insemination at this last generation treatment, that's at time 0, or at 16 hours. So we're looking at a co-sync versus 16 hours, this time in the context of a double ovsync protocol. We actually did this study for a different reason, but I'm just going to show you the results from this part of it. So here's the 2 protocols, the end of the co-sync protocol here, or we've got the 16-hour time period. The difference was 36% conception rate versus 46% conception rate. That's a 28% increase in pregnancies per AI by doing timed AI at the right time, which is 16 hours, versus doing it in these co-sync protocols. Okay, so we kind of revisited this co-sync question again. It's about 10 percentage points that you're gonna sacrifice if you do a co-sync protocol. So again, I'd reiterate what I said before. We don't want to be doing these co-sync protocols. Very straightforward information right here. The second study is an observational study. This means that no treatments were applied. We're just looking at the cows and what happened. This was done on a very large farm. And so I think it was done on two different large dairies. And so what happens on these large dairies is you never get the timing of insemination perfect. You can't breed all the cows on large farms exactly at 16 hours. So the timing of insemination varied anywhere from 13 to 23 hours relative to this GnRH treatment. So I'm going to show you the data from this. This is the raw data. On the left, in the pink bars, is sex-sorted semen. On the right, in the blue bars, this is conventional beef semen. So there's over 13,000 lactating cows, 2 different herds in Texas were submitted to a double ovsync protocol. So we had 14,089 inseminations to first service, an additional 6,800 inseminations to this resync protocol, essentially, but they're all timed AIs as well. So let's walk through this. The black line are the number of inseminations on the right-hand y-axis here. So you can see they're trying to breed at 16 hours. In fact, 15 hours is when most of them are getting bred. That's probably just due to the milking routine and everything. Fewer are bred early and fewer are bred late. So this is just the number of inseminations. But the thing I want to point out, and this is the same for this conventional semen as well, these conception rates are relatively flat across this time period. And this really wasn't what we expected. You know, we've been recommending 16 hours for a very long time. But if you can breed the cow between 13 and 23 hours, there's not a big effect on fertility. So that's the raw data. We take these raw data, we run them through a statistical model, and this is what the data look like. Relatively flat conception rates if you're doing a timed AI from 13 to 23 hours with either sexed or beef conventional semen. So this is good news for dairy farms. You don't have to stand there with a stopwatch and say, okay, it's 16 hours, it's time to breed the cows. You have a lot more time to get semen into cows relative to that last GnRH treatment. The one thing I'll reiterate here, these exclude the co-syncs, right? So that you don't want to do co-syncs, but if you can wait till 13 hours and get semen into them from 13 to 23 hours, you're pretty good across all those time periods. Okay, so the last experiment, this is again an observational study, and it's just assessing variation of timing of AI with an automated activity monitoring system. So a lot of our dairies have purchased some kind of a collar system or an ear tag system or a pedometer system. These are just a bunch of different systems that are out there. But what these systems do are measuring physical activity associated with estrus. And so we can use them to time insemination. And so again, this was done on these are lactating Holstein cows, Jersey cows, and crossbred cows from these two farms are in Texas and Arizona. And this data represents over 20,000 inseminations. And so again, the data on the left in pink are the sex-sorted Holstein or sex-sorted semen. In the green bars over here, this is conventional. And you can see, again, this black line is a frequency, right? So they're trying to breed. They're getting a lot of cows bred around this 8-hour time period, 4 to 12 hours or so. And then there's kind of another peak of activity out here, almost as if they're generating two different lists. Same over here with the conventional semen. And you can see that these are the raw data. And you can see if you breed too early, it's lower. If you breed too late, it's lower. That's the same with the sex-sorted semen as well as the conventional semen. So this is the raw data. You put it into a statistical model, and you see this. You can see if you breed too early, from 0 to about 13 hours, there's quite a big increase in conception rate. You can breed cows too early, in other words. And then after about that 23 hours, you start to see a pretty big decrease in conception rate if you're breeding them way too late. That's true for the sex-sorted semen. It's true for the conventional semen. So what this data tells us is that once daily breeding routines with these activity monitoring systems do not optimize fertility. You'll just take the average across this 24-hour time period. Really what you have to do with these activity monitoring systems to optimize conception rate would be to generate lists twice a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and go out and breed the cows. Now, what we did with this data is we took out this 13 to 23 hour time period that I showed you before and did a quick analysis on that. It's very flat during that time period. Again, if you can get semen in to these cows relative to the estrus alert from 13 to 23 hours, it's pretty flat. Again, good news for dairy farms, but we're going to have to be generating lists of cows twice a day if you want to optimize fertility with that. Now, the last thing we did with this last data set is we took those early breedings, those breedings that happened between 0 and 2 hours after the activity alert versus 15 to 16 hours. And again, you can see it's a big increase, 38% versus 49%. That's 29% increase with conventional semen. With the sex-sorted semen, it's even greater, 37% to 54%. That's almost a 50% increase in fertility breeding at the right time versus breeding too early. So I'm going to summarize kind of everything that I've said in this webinar so far. I just put together this figure. The last GnRH of a timed AI program is physiologically equivalent to the onset of estrus activity as far as the timing of ovulation. We know on average they're going to ovulate about 28 hours with some variation after G2 or after onset of an estrus alert. The optimal timing of AI in both of these cases is from 13 to 23 hours. You can see here in the green. This is where we're going to get our highest fertility. We're breeding before the cows ovulate to give time for sperm transport and capacitation. This is our optimal window for fertility. Now, the things that limit fertility are the sperm viability, and this is still a question. I think there's bull to bull variation in sperm viability, but um, we're not exactly sure how long sperm are viable for. It depends on the bull, but I put in here 24 to 30 hours. You start getting too late, less fertility, they're very fertile a little bit earlier. The thing that really limits this, though, is the oocyte viability. It's only about 6 to 12 hours after ovulation. And so when we look at the two mistakes that we can make, if you inseminate too early relative to G2 or the onset of estrus activity, we get decreased fertility due to aged sperm. It's a sperm problem. The sperm starts to basically conk out before we get to the ovulation. So that's one mistake we can make, is to breed too early. The consequences of breeding too late is that we get decreased fertility due to an aged oocyte. So that oocyte is in the reproductive tract. It comes from the follicle. It rests right halfway down the oviduct and sits there and waits. And what happens when you breed too late? That oocyte ages. It has to wait for too long. And so that's the limitation we get with fertility in that particular case. So just a nice model to think about as far as the mistakes we can make and the optimization we want to do with the timing of insemination relative to that last gene or age of the onset of estrus activity. So I'll just finish up with some take-home messages here. Correct timing of insemination is critical for good fertility. We've known that for a long time. These co-sync protocols may be fun and easy to do, but they result in poor fertility because insemination occurs too early relative to ovulation. Got lots of data on that now. This is a big recommendation here. Stop doing co-sync protocols. The insemination window for optimal fertility is approximately 13 to 23 hours after that last gene or age of a double ovsync protocol or after an estrus alert based on an activity monitoring system. This, however, requires generating lists of cows twice daily when using an activity monitoring system. The once daily breeding programs are not going to optimize fertility based on the data that I just showed you. And I didn't really talk about this during the webinar, but there's no real difference in optimal timing of AI between conventional and sex-sorted semen. None of that really came out in that last paper that I showed you in those large data sets. So it appears that we don't have to delay breeding with sex semen. What we want to do is just be very accurate and breed at the right time, which is 13 to 23 hours after G2 or after an estrus alert. All right, Fred, with that, I've gotten through all of my slides here, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining the webinar, and we'll see if there's any questions that anyone has.
At this point, thank you, Dr. Fricke. What kind of small enough group, if somebody wants to unmute and ask a question directly, they can do that, or they can go ahead and type a question into the chat box. I'll kind of kick things off. Do you see a limit to improvement on reproductive efficiency? What's out there that you see is going to change and improve it?
So overall, reproductive efficiency in dairy herds?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, being a reproductive physiologist, this is a question that we think about a lot. I mean, I think moving forward, genetics for fertility, the ability to do genomic testing and select for more fertile animals is going to be a big impact moving forward. The problem with that, Fred, is that there is a very strong negative relationship between milk production, the genetics for milk production, and the genetics for fertility. And we showed this in a really interesting data set we have in heifers. The most fertile heifers were the least productive. And it came out, you know, in the genetics for heifer conception rate, you know, so you can predict that with the genomics even before they come into lactation. So I think that's a little bit of something that we're fighting as far as good fertility. But you know, the good news, Fred, is that the fertility programs, the high fertility cycle, all these things have led to unprecedented high levels of fertility in our dairy. And the last thing I'll say, a topic for a talk that I'm getting ready to put together, we've seen these really big increase in 21-day pregnancy rates in the dairy industry. there are certain factors that are putting downward pressure on fertility. Number one, the adoption of sex semen. So sex semen, you're going to have a conception rate drag. So that's going to bring it down. The more sex semen you use, you're going to decrease that. Number two, people are starting to try to decrease their herd turnover rates, which leads to older herds. And older cows are less fertile than younger cows. And so that's another factor. As a herd gets more mature, you're going to get lower overall fertility as well. So these are some questions that have been coming up, and I've been looking at different, working with different dairies in through these different scenarios. But there's a couple factors that are fighting kind of against the improvements that we've made lately. So kind of a roundabout answer to your question there, Fred.
Mike's asking if there's a difference in fertility with sex semen comparing heifer versus parity, second, third, so on.
Yeah, in fact, there is. I mean, generally, Mike, the rule of thumb that I use is that you're going to get about 85% of the fertility of conventional semen with sex. So in randomized controlled trials, that's what you see. So that's going to be true whether you're breeding heifers or you're breeding the older lactating dairy cows. You're going to see that reduction in fertility. There's older data with sex semen. The better managers tend to have less of a gap between the fertility of conventional and sex semen. Poorer managers, that gap tends to increase. And the last thing I'll say about this, everybody wants to compare fertility using different semen types within their herd. But you have to account for the cows that you're using the semen types on. So for example, you can go into herd management software now and you can generate a conception rate, like I showed in the one slide there, a conception rate for all the sex semen breedings versus all the conventional or all the beef semen breedings. Oftentimes what you'll see is no difference or no gap, or you'll see, sometimes sex semen is actually better. You can see in some of the data that I was showing in our last paper that sex semen actually look numerically better than conventional semen, but you have to account for the fact that you're using sex semen at earlier inseminations in younger, more fertile animals. And so it's only in the randomized controlled studies that you can actually make these comparisons in fertility. And there's a number of those in the literature now. So we know that there is a conception rate drag with sex semen.
We have another question about ideal voluntary waiting period today, especially in first lactations.
Wow, that's a great question, and it's a question that that is somewhat controversial that I think we don't have necessarily a good answer to. I mean, it's a modeling question, right? So let me begin this way. If I could make cows calve and then peak in lactation and stay at peak lactation indefinitely until they're 20 years old, if I could do that, I would never want to get a cow pregnant again. Okay. But the shape of the lactation curve is such that they peak in production and then generally decrease in production over time. So what that says is that there's an optimal time that we want to get a cow pregnant again, so she calves and repeats that, that peak in milk. Most statistical models will tell us, or economic models will tell us, that we want cows pregnant at about 115 to 120 days in milk. Okay, that's kind of optimal based on the shape of the lactation curve. Now, you may ask, well, why do we have voluntary waiting periods that are shorter than that? And it's because we don't have 100% conception rates. If I could get cows pregnant, all cows pregnant at first service, we would probably delay first service breeding for a long time. But we're at about 50% conception rates. So you need time to get the cows pregnant. Now, the questioner was dealing specifically with first lactation animals. And of course, first lactation animals have a very different shape of a lactation curve. They have a very much more persistent curve, right? So people say, well, we can delay breeding in first lactation animals. And we can to some degree, but here's what I want you to consider. When you get a first lactation cow pregnant, you get her into second lactation faster where she gives more milk. Okay. So you can't just increase the voluntary waiting period indefinitely in first lactation cows. That's a model would do that if it doesn't account for the fact that a first lactation cow becomes the second lactation cow, which then becomes the third lactation cow. Okay. So again, back to the voluntary waiting period question, I think it depends on the breeding program. If you're primarily using detection of estrus for first breeding, I think we need to be in that 60-day in milk voluntary waiting period because you have to wait for cows to show heat. If you're using a timed insemination program, most farms that I think are doing well are somewhere in the 70 to 80-day range at first insemination. And that's because you can breed them all at the end of the voluntary waiting period and get about half of them pregnant. So that's kind of where we are with voluntary waiting periods. In the end, voluntary waiting period is optimized on individual animals. But until we have computer systems that'll tell us, when we should breed based on the risk of getting pregnant and so on and so forth, most farms are going to be 60 days in milk if they're watching for estrus, about 70 to 80 days in milk if they're doing a timed AI. So again, a long answer. That's a very complex and controversial topic, depending on who you talk to and what modeling exercises you're looking at.
Thank you. Do we see breed differences? And I'm especially talking about our crossbred herds.
Yeah. In breed differences, this is a good question. Breed differences in what? In optimal timing of insemination or in estrus expression? I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
Let's start with expression.
Yeah. Traditionally, the smaller cows, the Jerseys and crossbreds, are known to have better estrus expression. There's data to that effect, especially older data with the heat watch system. They'll show heat more intensely and for a longer period of time compared to the Holstein. That may be production related based on the liver metabolism hypothesis that I showed in this particular seminar. What's interesting, though, is that the Jersey was always thought of as the more fertile animal than the Holstein, but we don't see that in data. And in fact, there was a very interesting trial, a very interesting comparison looking at which is more profitable to milk, Holsteins or Jerseys. And this was Barry Bradford's work out of Michigan State. And surprisingly, when they looked at reproductive performance and what they had three herds in the upper Midwest that had both Holsteins and Jerseys, so kind of controlled for environment, right, on these three farms. And what they showed is there was no advantage. Now that we have fertility programs, now that we have double ovsync programs, there's really not a big difference in fertility between the Holsteins and the Jerseys. So that's no longer a advantage for those animals. Where they did have an advantage was maybe for some of the health traits and things like that. So yeah, there are some breed differences. But in the age of genomics with the Holsteins, we have Holstein herds now given over 4% fat components. Fred, maybe we should plug the fact that we had the 7-pound club at our meeting, and it's amazing how many combined pounds of fat and protein we're seeing in some of these herds, and that's out of a Holstein. And so they give so much more milk that they kind of blow away some of the crossbreds in the Jerseys as far as total pounds of fat and protein that are saleable. So
I would give a shameless plug if folks would like to hear the comments from the herd that was recognized at our conference at nearly 8.5 pounds of solids. They can see that there at the Fourth State Dairy Nutrition Conference website.
yep.
And
2 Minnesota herds, I believe, and 1 Wisconsin herd, I think is
that's
the way that shook out.
Yep. Got a question that came in from Trisha. What is to be done for better fertility on dairy cows that are milking over 110 pounds?
Well, that's a great question. And what I would say is that the double off sync protocol was made for high production herds. That's it. It addresses what we think is the major problem in these high producing cows, which is the liver metabolism. When you end up, I kind of walked through that pretty quickly. We've by increasing production and increasing liver blood flow, we've changed the endocrine environment of these cows. So they don't show estrus as well. We also have lower progesterone. Both of those can affect fertility. And double off sync was specifically designed to correct that particular problem. It increases progesterone during growth of the synchronized follicular wave. It ovulates the follicle because before it gets too large and overstimulated by LH. And I didn't show any of these data. We have two different studies now where we've compared one in Jerseys, one in Holsteins, where we compared cows on a double ovsync protocol, these high producing cows, versus cows that are synchronized to estrus. And in both of those studies, the advantage was 10 percentage points, 10 percentage points in conception rate for double ovsync over estrus. So that is by far and away, I think, one of the best things that we can do for fertility in these high producing dairy cows. Now, having said that, I was just out in Western Kansas this last week. You know, you have herds out there that are given 65 or 70 pounds of milk. That's a very different situation as far as what's affecting fertility. They're not high enough producing that they're really getting that liver metabolism problem. But so there was other fertilities problems in some of those particular herds. But Tricia, I would say double ovsync is a pretty good way to improve fertility in these high producing cows. And I'd be glad if you email me, I'd be glad to send you those papers comparing directly fertility to estrus versus double ovsync.
Again, I remind folks that they'll type in the chat a question, or they can unmic and ask a question. We've got a question, and it's long. Dr. Fricke, I'll let you read that.
Oh, okay.
You
Let me
can
look at it here.
Yeah.
Okay, my farm's using. How much? Okay, so you're using double ovsync. Activity monitors only to catch open cows, breeding only about 18 to 20. How much do I really lose from a once daily activity breeding? It's a good question. I mean, you're only affecting 18 to 20% of the cows in the herd. In that particular scenario, I think, you know, I wouldn't have a problem doing once daily breedings to estrus because it's a smaller population of cows and it's probably not going to be that detrimental to the 21-day pregnancy rate. Most of the bang for your buck is coming from the timed AI. The one thing I'll say, if you think about it, a timed AI program, if you do timed AI at the right time relative to that last generation, you're optimizing the timing of insemination relative to ovulation. It's just in the estrus breedings, you're not doing that with once daily breeding. But I see the point of the question. It's just a low percentage of cows you're dealing with. So again, I don't think it'd be a big problem to do once daily. It's the farms like when I was in Western Kansas, they would flip those numbers. Only 18 to 20% of the cows would be on a timed AI program. 80% would be bred to an estrus. I think then it makes a big difference as far as once daily versus doing lists in the morning and afternoon. So hopefully that answers the question there.
Okay, we've talked about getting the semen at the right time in the right place for reproductive efficiency, especially when we're looking at beef semen. Are there breed differences in getting cows pregnant with different breeds?
Ugh. Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, those studies haven't been done. You'd have to randomize cows to either get bred to a Holstein versus a beef sire. The one thing I can say is that Holsteins and Jerseys in particular, those bulls have been selected for many, many generations for fertility, for scrotal circumference, for all these kinds of things. The beef breeds early on, I think we saw some problems with some of the beef breedings because people were looking for beef sires all over the place. I think the increased use of beef semen caught everybody a little flat-footed, but I will hand it to the AI companies They really have done a nice job of getting these beef sires going. I think the last time I looked, the top two sires used in Holsteins were Angus sires. Those, they've got calving age data, they've got fertility data on those animals. I don't think there's any big difference between that sire. Now there's individual sires. We look at sire conception rate and those kinds of things. We can measure differences, but it's plus or minus probably 4 percentage points on the sire conception rate side of things. So we can select the sires for fertility, but breed differences, I don't think so.
Okay. Another question came in. Is a second GnRH shot recommended before breeding on double off-sync for first lactation? And then a follow-up, could you give 3cc once instead?
I think this question is uh, not GnRH. I think they're talking about prostaglandin. Is the second prostaglandin recommended um, versus doubling the dose of prostaglandin? If you could clarify that on that question, I think that's the way yeah, okay, that's what I thought. We've done some experiments with that. Yeah, if you look at the protocols, you give in the second off sync of a double off sync, right? You give GnRH and then the next Monday prostaglandin. Then we have another prostaglandin in there on Tuesday. Okay, that is to address a problem with these protocols in that we weren't getting complete luteal regression because you're trying to regress an early corpus luteum there. And so the second prostaglandin was added. When that second prostaglandin was added to these protocols, that was the key to the fertility program. We just saw fertility increase. It solved the problem with lack of synchrony, essentially. But it's more work, right? You got to give that second. Nobody wants to go out and give that second treatment. So we did some experiments where we doubled the dose of prostaglandin at day 7, okay, versus a single dose on day 7 versus 2 doses, one on day 7 and one on day 8. So hopefully I'm explaining this well. There's 2 different prostaglandin compounds. Okay, one is dinoprost, and dinoprost is the native prostaglandin. Doubling the dose or increasing the dose of the native prostaglandin had no effect. Okay, the other compound we have is cloprostanol. It's a synthetic prostaglandin, and it has a longer half-life. And this is the way I put it, and there's maybe some people that would argue with me. Doubling the dose on day 7 is better. It actually improved conception rate, but I still don't think it's quite as good as 2 doses 24 hours apart, cloprostanol. The optimal is going to be given the 2 doses, but increasing the dose, and I probably would double the dose. I wouldn't do 3 cc's. I would give 4 at day 7. It's going to be better than a single dose, but not as good as the 2 24 hours apart. So hopefully that answers that question. It's a great question. You guys are asking questions about other stuff that I talk about rather than timing of AI, which is fine, which is good. We're talking about repro today, so.
Very good. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. Wait just a second and we'll talk about folks, you will be receiving an email from me when we have this program actually up and archived, so you can listen to it a second time. You will also receive a link for evaluation. This is how we make improvements. We ask you just 4 questions, and hopefully the next time you come on, you will see the results of your answers. The next time you will be invited to join us is August 13th, and Dr. Bales from Michigan will be talking about using high oleic soybeans in dairy cow rations. So I'm not seeing a question. Thank you very much, Dr. Fricke. We appreciate your time, and I will be closing this down.
Thank you, Fred.